Tributes and memories continue to come in for former President Jimmy Carter, who died Sunday at the age of 100.
For some people who live in Maine, Carter's legacy is complicated. In a statement about his passing, the Wabanaki Alliance mentioned two of President Carter's actions that directly affected tribes. One, a national measure to keep Indigenous children with Indigenous families in the event that a child had to be removed from a home. The other is the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act.
When Carter signed the act in 1980, there was optimism from the federal and state governments and the tribes. But in the last 44 years, the law has been used by the state to assert more control over tribal activity.
So what was the act designed for, and how has it been used in the past 4 decades? We took a closer look 2 years ago. October 10th, 1980. A day that would change the relationship between Maine and the Wabanaki nations forever. As President Jimmy Carter signed a document called the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act. The act came after a long legal battle between the state of Maine and two of the Wabanaki Nation's tribes, the Passamaquoddy and Penobscot Nation. At the time, the tribes claimed 12 million acres, or nearly 2/3 of the state of Maine, belonged to them, and they said they had proof. A federal judge agreed with them. The ruling forced the state and the tribes to work together and reach a settlement agreement to be approved by Congress. The agreement would give the tribes $81.5 million in reparation for land taken from them. A sister law passed by the Maine legislature, the Maine Implementing Act, would determine how those assets would be distributed to the tribes and would also require them to follow Maine law. Maine's governor and the legislature viewed the outcome as a huge win. But the agreement and that photo means something entirely different to some members of the Wabanaki Nations, even all these years later.
I would explain it as the biggest piece of fraud in Maine's history, and maybe even the country's history.
At that time, it was a big, big deal for our tribal communities. As it turns out, the written words in the document didn't accurately capture the spirit and intent of the agreement, in my opinion.
I think people have been promised, maybe incorrectly, that even if things were a little bit off, that it was fixable, like that it could be the first draft of something.
Donna Loring, Darren Ranco, and Maria Gerard, all members of the Penobscot Nation, have spent hours combing through the settlement and its history. They believe that, for the Wabanaki people, the act had the unintended and unwanted effect of taking away the tribe's sovereignty. Sovereignty is defined as having supreme power or authority as a self-governing state. And while the act was written in a way that allowed the tribes to go back and make amendments as needed, they say that process didn't work as they expected.
There was a lot of hope that this was the beginning of a new relationship, that we were going to be, working government to government or as equals. And it doesn't seem like that came to pass.
Their vision was always to assimilate the tribes and have the tribal communities become municipalities, political subdivisions of the state, which is how they're interpreting that document now. And they're referring to us over and over again as municipalities. When they wrote that claims, they put in that, if it's changed, then it needs to be an agreement between the tribe and the state. Because we know that things change over the years, and there may be some gray areas or some gaps. So, we'll leave that door open so that you guys can negotiate and make some changes. Well, what happened was, whenever there was a disagreement, it would go to state court. And who would win that argument? Wasn't the tribes.
Records show at the time of the agreement, the tribes had been living in extreme poverty.
And they were in poverty because the state controlled their access to the economy.
In 1976, after receiving federal recognition, some money had begun to flow into the tribes, giving them more control over their economic future. Gerard recalls it was a transformative time for Indian Island.
I remember when I was a young girl growing up here on the island, but I saw the changes that happened in our community. Where we're sitting right now was just a big ball field at the dead end of a road. And everything north of here was all built up as infrastructure. The first phase of housing was being developed, and it was something so beyond us. We nicknamed it Hollywood. So these new phases of housings that were coming in were like really, nice by our standards, and we could see how our community was growing and having opportunities and just building up. It was like before our eyes.
The 1980 Settlement Act signaled another potential shift in economic development for the tribes. With the money they received from the settlement, the tribes made good investments and bad. One of those deals, the purchase of the Dragon Products Company in Thomaston, New England's only cement maker. The tribes sold it to a Massachusetts-based company a few years later. The New York Times said the deal, which sources valued at $80 million, is an example of the increasingly aggressive business posture of American Indian tribes. Another investment the Penobscots had high hopes for, the Sauk Alexis Ice Arena, which was built on Indian Island in 1984.
We had a lot of children that were playing ice hockey, and we thought this was a great way to invite people over and to be part, and it didn't pan out that way, but the arena still stands, and it's been through a couple different lifespans. It was then the high stakes bingo, and then that became challenged with the casinos in Bangor and some of the, I would say, inequitable gaming laws of the state. So there were a lot of factors, and like Donna said, we didn't know a whole heck of a lot about being business owners in the beginning, but we did the best we could, and everything's a lesson learned.
That story was from a couple years ago. Recently, an act to give the tribes more sovereignty passed both the Maine House and Senate with comfortable margins, but was vetoed by Governor Janet Mills, who said that if enacted, the legislation could have unforeseen impacts on Maine law.